Welcome to today's Webinar Wednesday. We're super excited to have NJJN with us today, and they're going to do a quick presentation for you guys on diversion and preventing youth arrest, which, as a lot of you guys know, is a super important aspect of criminal justice reform and our criminal justice activism. So, Allison, if you want to take it away, introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sure. Thank you guys for having us. So I'm Allison Clemens. I'm the Director of Advocacy here at NJJN, and I'm joined by Joran Biggs, who's one of our longtime youth leaders, and I'll do a fuller introduction to him on the next slide, but we're really excited to be here. And as Anna said, we'll talk a little bit about how to prevent youth arrest and some about sort of diversion policies and best practices. So just a little bit more about NJJN, and then I'll turn it over to Jordan to share a little bit about himself and fully introduce himself. But NJJN is comprised of members all across the country. So we have 60 member organizations in 42 states and DC that are all working to change youth justice policy. And as you guys probably know, we have 50 different state systems that all treat young people differently. And so our goal at NJJN is really to make sure that we're supporting the work of on-the-ground advocates to make sure that there's system reform and that we transform what remains of the system into something that actually works for young people and their families. And so we often do policy platforms on different issues in the field, and we did one specifically on diversion and preventing youth arrest. And in doing so, we wanted to really hear from young people, and we're at the time, Joran was a young person in North Carolina. I think you were a high school senior, if I recall correctly. And so he actually joined one of our focus groups and was key to the recommendations that informed this particular report. So we were super excited to be able to have him here with us. He's played numerous roles, including as a member of our Membership Advisory Council and soon to be our board of directors. But Jordan, do you want to introduce yourself and say hi to everyone?
Sure. Hi, everybody. As Allison said, I'm Joran Biggs. I've been working with NJJN for quite some time and don't see any signs of stopping anytime soon. I'm a sophomore at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill studying political science and African American studies. And through NJJN, I've been able to sort of focus my academic work, like my extracurricular work, on studying how the school to prison pipeline and juvenile justice in general has to be transformed in order to better the welfare of young people and subsequently better the welfare of the whole community.
So we'll talk a little bit more, but we want us to sort of start with why is diversion and preventing youth arrest important? And I'm sure everybody who's on this call thinks it's a really important issue, but just as a little bit of background, and Joran, please pop in, but the justice system as it exists doesn't work for young people, it doesn't work for families, and it really doesn't work for communities. So Joran, do you want to say a little bit more about it? And I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah, so I think we're at a really interesting point societally where through the actions of last summer, Black Lives Matter protests, the really heightened attention on anti-Black racism, we've been forced to grapple with how the justice system doesn't work. And I think as a general rule, if we can acknowledge it doesn't work for adults, it definitely doesn't work for young people. So acknowledging how policing and different aspects of the justice system have seeped into these institutions that young people exist in, be it public schools or increased policing in their communities. We acknowledge that the trauma that this inflicts has no place where young people are. And that in order to minimize that and reduce harm as much as we can, we need to create these diversion programs that Allison and I are speaking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Joran. And I will say too, there's a lot of research out there that shows one, that if you put a kid into the youth justice system, that it actually it's quote said to rehabilitate kids, right? That's the goal of it. But all the research shows that it actually makes kids more likely to come back into the system. So we're not providing kids with anything that they actually need to be successful. We're actually causing them to cycle back in. And at the same time, to Joran's point, right, we know detention causes mental health issues. We know that detention causes physical harm. Sometimes kids are at risk of sexual harm. And so we're putting kids in like real dangerous way for something that doesn't even, doesn't work. It doesn't work for kids, and it doesn't increase public safety because we're seeing crimes rise as kids are involved in the justice system. So really what we wanted to do with this report was highlight what the CDC says, which is that investment in like early childhood education, making sure families have what they need, making sure people have food and stable housing, is what keeps crime down. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we sort of prefaced this a little bit, or we pre-gamed it, but how to prevent youth arrest, right? So we'll outline 5 different ways that we can really reduce the arrest of young people. Jordan, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So the first point we have is supporting healthy living generally. So it's no secret that disinvestment has ravaged communities of color all across the country. And we've seen police budgets balloon while education budgets and public health budgets have shrank. So acknowledging how the environment that creates leads to situations where young people are in circumstances that may lead them to justice involvement. Work has to be done to reorient the way these actions are looked at from an institutional standpoint, and shifting away from punitive measures and towards framing youth well-being as a matter of public health. So like the slide says, counties across the country have recognized this and are shifting from incarceration to public health responses. And I think one of the best examples of this is one of NJJN's member organizations, the Anti-Recidivism Collective in Los Angeles. And they were successful last year in pushing the LA County Board of Supervisors to remove juvenile justice from the jurisdiction of the corrections department and moving funds to create a separate health-focused entity to engage with system-involved young people. So continuously acknowledging that uh, punishment isn't a sufficient means to address the underlying issues, and that in order to get to the root causes of a lot of the behavior, we have to treat this as a public health crisis.
That's exactly right. And Jordan, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think there's a real trend across the country, as Jordan pointed out, LA is sort of leading the way. There's other places that are doing efforts to get detention down to 0. So King County in Washington sort of leading that effort. And there's really this push, right, to make sure that we're meeting young people's needs rather than throwing them into an incarceration system that is just going to lock them up and not support them. And the key way of doing that is shifting the funding from corrections to public health. And another place that we just started seeing this actually like just this year is you might have seen some emergency declarations to name racism as a public health issue or public health emergency, and that allows states to redirect funds. So if you've heard of that, this is similar, right? We're trying to create an emergency here and say, we really need to be applying the same funding that we're applying to public health issues like COVID to incarceration, which is harming young people and their families. Joran, back to you.
So our second point is guiding youth and creating community systems where young people can have someone safe to talk to when issues come up. And as the slide says, again, not to rely on that too heavily, but the creation of like credible messenger programs or mentorship programs where young people can have a safe space to openly voice their opinions and not necessarily feel the need to rely on different activities that would again maybe push towards justice involvement.
And I will say that this recommendation came a lot out of the focus group that we were in with you and your peers, Joran, right? Like everyone was saying, well, in these different scenarios that are popping up, what kids really need is somebody to guide them, somebody that they can rely on, maybe not a teacher because we don't really trust our teachers, but somebody who can sort of give us good advice and tell us how they moved through the system or how they sort of address these issues in their own communities. And so to Jordan's point, there's a really great program called Credible Messengers. There's a program, so the program that runs it in New York is called Arches, and they employ formerly incarcerated young people, and then they partner them with young people who are sort of in high-risk communities. And they're basically, it's like a buddy system, right? Or a mentoring system. And they found a 50 to 70%, sort of depending on what number you're looking at, reduction in youth behaviors that would land them in juvenile court, just by sort of pairing folks who'd been through it, right, and knew how to support young people. And so it's one of those things that's like super intuitive, right? Like anyone will know, like, well, we just need somebody to talk to. But it's also something that research shows and pilot studies show really works for young people. This is your sweet spot, Joran.
Yes, so building restorative schools. I think maybe the most immediate example is just the Counselors Not Cops initiatives that we've seen pop up around the country, and just stressing the importance of funding these non-justice system actors within schools. So there's been a rise in placing cops in schools, typically in the forms of student resource officers or SROs. And that really just creates a system that mirrors the inequities in policing, right? So we're seeing Black and brown kids, kids who identify as LGBTQ, consistently being referred more to the justice system for minor infractions. So things like a school fight that would normally be handled administratively, like with a principal or a vice principal, turn into situations where young people can be referred to the judicial system and potentially get thrust into that and create a record. So I think in looking at organizations like the Youth Justice Project in North Carolina, who have been tracking suspensions throughout the state and noticing that suspension rates and expulsion rates sort of mirror the same sort of disparities we were talking about with policing, in that in order to combat youth getting involved with the justice system, you have to create a school environment that where there's parity in punishment and a lack of emphasis on punishment generally, an acknowledgement that counselors and nurses and these health officials are what young people need in order to get the sort of wraparound services that ensure they're as healthy as possible.
Yeah, and there's just a couple other things I was going to add. So, I mean, Joran talked about this brilliantly, and there's been a lot movement for a long time to get counselors in schools instead of cops. And now we see this whole push for police-free schools in the wake of George Floyd's death. And you see counties all across the country sort of ending the presence of police in schools, from Minneapolis to Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine. And so I really think that that's the way of the future. I think the other thing that really came out, again, of talking to young people, so we talked with folks in North Carolina and Nebraska, so not to keep pointing back to you, Joran, but I think one of the things that kept coming up too was, you know, we have these classes that teach us math. We learn about, you know, English skills, but nobody is teaching us like conflict resolution skills. And so really embedding that into a school model so that um, you know, every teenager, every human gets into a fight or an argument, and learning how, like, best practices, right, on how to resolve those and really how to sort of heal relationships should be taught in schools just as well as math and English. I feel like there's one other thing I was gonna mention here, but I will probably circle back to it at the end. So. Oh, I know what it was. Sorry. So the other thing that I would say we see, which Joran also touched on, but if you look at the numbers of arrests of young people, it's obviously different per jurisdiction, but by and large, like 50% of the arrests come from schools, while 50% come from the community. So if we can just tackle the school issue and get police out of schools, so arrests aren't coming from schools, the number of young people coming into the justice system is almost immediately reduced by half. So it's sort of a huge area of reform possibility, which goes to our next piece about reducing police contact.
A beautiful segue. But I think having this right after building restorative schools just goes to show how intersectional these issues really are, and these how intersectional the solutions are as well. So as Allison said, school is usually a big part of how police come in contact with young people. I mean, obviously in COVID, police interaction sort of operates in a modified manner, but the issue still generally goes hand in hand with building restorative schools and creating healthy communities. And just acknowledging that safety isn't the presence of police, but the presence of a healthy environment, the presence of people who have access to resources and who have been uh, raised to believe that uh, not to necessarily fear where they live, not to be under constant police surveillance and stuff like that. So, along with this, there are countless states across the country looking to raise the minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction. And this is a way in which we can keep young people, starting at younger ages, from interacting with courts at all. So I know in at least 12 states, they're looking to raise the minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction to 12 or older. So making sure we're not having elementary schoolers in court for a minor infraction at school.
Yeah, I think that's a huge reform in terms of just immediately decreasing numbers, right? If we can make sure young people aren't coming into contact with the system at all for anything, um, obviously those numbers go down quickly. I'll say that usually when people think about this, right, like we think about decriminalization broadly. I feel like it's most commonly referred to the decriminalization of like substance abuse and drugs, but I really think like the minimum age, just in terms of setting a blanket bar, um, is sort of the bigger issue here, right? So it's not just about decriminalizing one offense or another, but about sort of broadly cutting down those who can have access to the system. So next is all about developing community supports. Jordan, do you want to tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I think this point in particular uh, really hones in on the point that communities know best what they need, and just creating environments again where um, infractions are not treated as something to be referred to the criminal justice system, but as matters of public health. So increasing funding for different programs that address different things young people need as they age, and reducing the likelihood that they will end up in the justice system. So again, things like funding education and funding things that have historically been underfunded in the communities where we're seeing over policing and a disproportionate interaction rate with the justice system.
Yeah, and there's a number of different community-based programs that are really proven to support young people. So I know we talked about a number of them. I will just name a few others. So, and maybe I can send this around after the webinar to folks, but there's a whole report called Health Solutions Create Safety. And it goes through a lot of what we've already talked about, but it also outlines some additional programs that you can advocate in your own community for. So a few of those are just Cure Violence, which I don't know if folks have heard of, but it's a gun prevention, gun crime prevention program. And really what they do is like, if, for example, if somebody shows up in a hospital with a gunshot wound, what we know is that oftentimes there's like retaliation events that happen in communities that lead to additional gun violence. And so there's different social workers and folks who will come around, talk about how this particular incident of gun violence happened, and then go into the community, and there's already community workers on the ground who are sort of tasked with keeping the peace between different groups of people, so there isn't a retaliation effort and an increased gun violence. We talked a little bit about credible messengers, so I won't go into that. There's also, in addition to just restorative schools, there's a whole push for restorative justice to be implemented more broadly, so both in communities, so that again, if there is a harm done in a community, that the community themselves can sort of, I don't want to use the word police, but right, come in and police the issue and resolve the issue and make sure that both the victims and the person who harmed the other person really get their needs met. So those are sort of some specific ways to reduce different types of violence. I will say, and this has been like my favorite fun fact from a long time ago, but one of the best things that we can actually do to reduce violence in communities, like build parks and put in playgrounds and put in like basketball courts, that in and of itself has been shown to reduce violence in communities. And so there's a whole bunch of ways we can go about really supporting young people and reducing violence in communities that have absolutely nothing to do with arrest. So with that, we have the full platform on our website. I linked to it here. I can make sure Anna and everybody has the link to the platform and the full infograph, and then that report about health solutions that we talked about. And I think with that, unless you have anything else, Jordan, we can answer questions that folks have.
All right, if anybody has any questions, please just put them in the chat. You can either put them, you can either do the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll be willing to answer, they'll be willing to answer anything. So any questions?
So I see there's one question on what the #1 advice to police officers would be. Jordan, do you have thoughts on that at all?
Not too many thoughts, just because I think generally, like, the end goal of all of this is reducing interaction with police, period. But I think in the interim, it's definitely useful for officers to enter the work with the understanding that um, acting in a way that prioritizes punitive responses to uh, these different circumstances where young people are near the justice system or at risk of entering it isn't the way to go. In that, in policing, creating accountability structures that allow for communities to create safety beyond officer involvement is necessary.
Allison, I don't think we can hear you.
Thanks. I was muted and telling you all of my thoughts, but I would just repeat really quickly. So we have seen where a lot of reform efforts have focused on training police and really sort of getting them to understand positive youth development and using youth specific language. And while those efforts have been implemented, there's still been sort of equal numbers of arrest. And so it hasn't impacted that. So to Jordan's point, I think it's really about saying there are lots of things that don't require arrest and don't require police intervention. So just sort of wanted to build on that. But there's more questions coming in. So how do we as young people get started with addressing these issues? Jordan, I feel like you're perfect to answer that.
Yeah, so I feel like my entrance was a little bit of like a system of, or a series of fortunate events, because I ended up being referred to through my counselor to a steering committee with the Youth Justice Project in North Carolina, which eventually led to me working with Allison and everyone in NJJN. But I think a good way of getting started is just looking around the schools we go to and acknowledging problems and seeing how some schools, especially where I was from, some schools had SROs, some schools didn't have SROs. Some schools had zero tolerance policies where if there was any infraction or breaking of the rules, you got kicked out. While some schools had different strategies to address the action that led to you being on the verge of being kicked out. So I think really looking at the places we exist in and seeing what disparities exist within them is a good way to get started.
And I will just say too, so we have members in not every state, but most states. And so a lot of them are doing similar work as to what Joran outlined and what I've outlined here. So connecting with your local NJJN group is also a good way to sort of figure out what's happening in your state and how to get involved. Personally, what do you think is the best way to reduce police interaction? Do you have thoughts, Jordan? It's a big question.
It is. I'm gonna let you go first.
Sure, fair enough. I mean, I think so. We talked about some, right? So I think the best ways to reduce police interaction is to reduce the number of police in communities and in schools, right? So I'm not saying that there's never an instance where a police officer expertise might be needed, but we know that they're responding to a lot of things like school discipline issues. They're responding to things like, you know, a fist fight in a community, all of those things, even, right, like even with this gun violence model, we've seen where communities, if they're trained, if they're resourced, if they are really built up with expertise, that they can respond to it without police. And so I think sort of investing in those types of programs can help address that. But Jordan, you might have other thoughts.
No, everything you just said. I think all of the points we brought up generally fall under the umbrella of defunding the police and reallocating funds to community supports. And I think just building systems of accountability within communities so they can really address any issues they have internally and not introduce police into interactions is necessary.
And says, building off that, what would an ideal policing system look like? I have to be completely honest. I don't know. Um, so I'll turn it over to Jordan, but I think, so what I will say is my expertise is like youth justice policy, it's criminal justice policy, and really solutions that work for young people. And I know that we've seen where policing doesn't. So it's hard for me to reimagine a role for police, honestly, but maybe, so I can just say, I don't know, but maybe Jordan has thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'm about in the same boat, but I know I've been doing a lot of reading on abolition for different classes and different extracurricular things. And one of the main points of that is that you don't necessarily have to have an alternative system ready to go to acknowledge a current system isn't working. So I think it's fully possible to end something without necessarily knowing what you're going to do right after it, but reducing harm like in the most immediate way that we can.
So I think the next question is, what are some real life examples of reform efforts that have been memorable to you? Are there some that jump out for you, Jordan? I know some have for me, but you can go first.
Yeah, the first thing I thought about was raise the age in North Carolina and just the states, organizers around the state's general push to make sure the age of jurisdiction for young people getting charged with crimes was raised substantially. I don't remember what it was before the law got enacted, but I know it's around 17 or 18 now. I want to say, I could be wrong, but just seeing that happen where I lived was really cool. And I know it's always necessary to see success stories where we are because a lot of times the work can feel unattainable. It can feel like there's no real, the end goal isn't always readily in sight. But seeing stuff right where we are is super cool.
Yeah, no, that was a great win. It was fun watching you guys win that. I think the reform effort that really jumps out at me, as we've been doing a lot of work over the summer, I don't know if folks saw, but a 16-year-old named Cornelius Fredericks was killed in a sequel facility in Michigan. And so we worked with our member in Michigan to close down the 2 sequel facilities there, and have also been working with members across the country. So Sequel, the company that ran that facility where he was restrained and killed, also runs a number of residential treatment facilities all across the country. And so we've been able to close or get states to end contracts in California, Oregon, Washington, Ohio, and most recently Iowa after that's happened. And so we're continuing to push for that because we've seen so much similar traumas happening to young people in those particular facilities. And the next question is, are police guards in schools there to monitor weapons efficiently? So I think, and please jump in if I'm misinterpreting your question. The way that I'm reading this is the reason that police are in schools sort of to prevent like mass shooting arrests or mass shootings and things like that, like we saw with Columbine and Sandy Hook and Parkland, and they go on, and Santa Fe High School is, I just want to make sure, I think that's where we're going with that question. And I will just say that we did see a huge rise in the number of police in schools after Columbine in Colorado, which was probably before some of you guys were born, but a really long time ago. Police really, that's what has led to a steady increase of police officers in schools. I will say since then, the number of mass shootings in schools has not declined. So anecdotally, we would think that even with police in schools, we're seeing an increase in mass shootings. And so that's not, doesn't seem to be an answer. But Jordan, I don't know if you want to say more.
Yeah, I think you basically hit all the points, just acknowledging like how SROs are really on the rise after Columbine, and we haven't seen school violence decline the more police we put in them, but we've seen justice referrals increase with the presence of police in schools.
So the next question is, do you think gun violence is the biggest issue in regard to how police respond, or do you think it's something else? I have thoughts, but Jordan, do you have thoughts first?
Yeah, I think gun violence is obviously an issue, and I know even in thinking about the last question about police in schools to monitor and make sure there's no weapons there, um, this is another example of police being given jurisdiction over something that doesn't readily need their attention. Because, like we said, we've seen more SROs in schools, but we haven't seen more legislation dealing with guns that would stop the people who are entering the schools from getting them in the first place. So I think gun violence is an aspect that's been used to justify the presence of police in these areas where young people are, but policing in general, I think there's a whole lot more tentacles than the presence of guns that have to be explored and really dug into to recognize how it's harmful.
And I will say that I think, I mean, when I think about police and police violence that's happening, I don't think that it's they're responding to a bunch of gun violence and they get into shootouts and that's what's happening, right? That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that police are responding to things like stealing cigarettes or, using counterfeit $20 bills. And so in my mind, it goes to like, what is the role of police? What do they view the role of police, and what do communities actually need to be safe? And sort of rethinking all of those roles. So I know that's sort of a side to your question, but I will say that police are responding to a lot more than gun violence, and that's sort of a very small portion of what police are responding to. So the next question is, based on importance, what projects should be funded first when it comes to redistributing funds that would originally go to the police, and how can individuals bring this up to their communities in order to ensure it's being discussed? I have a general thought, which is what we know particularly about reinvestment in the youth justice system. So I will say there's been efforts for decades now to close youth prisons and reinvest those funds into communities. And states have passed legislation, prisons have been closed. And when we look at redistributing those funds, we can't like give a blanket, give this amount to schools, give this amount to communities, because there's like 50,000 different systems. So if you look at every community, if you look at every state, the needs are different. And so I think what really has to happen is that has to be a conversation with the communities that are in that police jurisdiction, right? So whether it's a state jurisdiction or whether it's in police, it's usually really hyper local. But Joran probably has something better to say because my answer is not really an answer.
No, I totally agree. It definitely has to be a super localized approach. And like we were saying, communities know best what they need. So I think it's a matter of going into these communities and seeing what the people who live there feel like they're lacking and what could be there in place of more police in order to help them feel safer where they live. I know in a lot of places, and I'm specifically thinking of Durham, where I'm from, where there's been multiple um, scenarios where police have been called to deal with mental health crises. And a couple of times the mental health crises have been issues regarding young people. So I think just acknowledging how mental health generally, because I think the statistic is something like uh, half of all issues of lethal force involve a disabled person dying. So acknowledging how all these services that could be better served by more counselors, more public health officials, more people in these communities trained to de-escalate situations and not this heavy reliance on police with guns um, will show us where that money needs to go to first.
Yeah, and I will say that there's like a bunch of steps that if that's work you're looking to do at your local level right now, I think there's a lot of tools and resources out there. So we're happy to connect you with those if that's something you're looking to do. So the next question is, what police interaction that has been in the news publicly angered you the most? Jorin?
I think there was a situation in Florida, I think it was, where there was an elementary school girl who ended up getting arrested and sent to jail over a temper tantrum. I think that's something that really made me upset because I think that's one of the most clear-cut examples of how police have way too much jurisdiction and how we're way too reliant on these punitive things, especially on young people when they act like young people. I mean, things like temper tantrums are common in elementary schoolers and 6-year-olds. And just the ease that the school called a police officer and had a little kid arrested was something that I found like ridiculous.
Yeah, no, she was 6, I think, right? And I will just say too, I mean, most recently that comes to mind is the 9-year-old in Rochester, New York, who was pepper sprayed. Her mom called for help with a mental health issue, and she was calling for her dad. And rather than anybody responding to it, picking up the phone and calling her father, they thought they needed to put her in a police car and then pepper spray her. So um, I don't know how that goes through anyone's mind. I don't know how no one picks up the phone and calls a parent. Obviously, I am not in that role, so I uh, can't imagine. But there's lots of things to choose from when it comes to being angry about police youth interactions. I think that list could go on. Um, could you expand on methods of making restorative justice effective for youth? So I will say there's this really great organization called Impact Justice. If you haven't checked it out, you should. They do lots of trainings and have like 3 webinars coming up on what is restorative justice, how to make it work for young people and communities, and then like really tangibly how to implement it in your particular jurisdiction. So they could give you 1,000 more things than I can tell you. But what I will say is that there's a lot of great examples of how to use circles and how to use other restorative processes for young people. And a lot of schools have used it, and a lot of states and jurisdictions have been using it as well. I think the key is sort of 2 big takeaways from my knowledge is who's doing it, right? So if a district attorney's office is doing it, I don't know that it can truly be restorative because there's this threat of a hammer, right? A threat of arrest. So a young person can't like fully navigate it in a way that they're thinking through their actions without fear of repercussion. And then the other thing I will say is really making sure that the process and the language being used is youth friendly. But Jordan, do you have other thoughts?
Not really. Everything you said was right on target, and I think, like you were alluding to, just making sure it's accessible, making sure the words we use are stuff the youth will understand and not super complicated legalese, or just normalizing it, creating, like you said, circles in schools and just circles in the community. So this isn't something that feels super duper new or super unfamiliar. Making sure people are coming into contact with restorative practices more often. Allison, I think you're on mute one more time.
I have like this little mute button and I keep forgetting I hit it. I'm sorry. If you could only pick one thing and to change automatically in the justice system, what would you choose? Jordan, do you want to kick it off?
I think I would probably remove police officers from schools. I think that's a super effective way. Like you said, like 50% of youth referrals are coming from schools. So I think that would be a super immediate way to address the issue and see direct results.
Yeah, no, I don't know that my answer is super different. I think I would say I just wouldn't arrest young people, right? So like we see in other countries. So when we were looking at the lower age of juvenile jurisdiction, so the international recommendation is that no young person under the age of 14 can go into a justice system. Some countries that is 18, right? So I know there was some kids visiting us from South America, and they were like, what do you mean a 17-year-old can go into a justice system? And it was just unfathomable to them that we even lock kids up. And so we've seen other countries do it. So there's no reason we can't. We just don't want to. So I think if anything, right, like the lower age of jurisdiction and making sure that kids can get services without being arrested, hopefully will pave the way so that no young person and ideally no person has to be locked behind bars to get services and supports that they need. I don't see anything else unless there's any in the chat, but I'm looking through really quickly. I think the only one is, do you think the case in Florida could be connected to the school to prison pipeline? Joran, you mentioned the Florida case. You want to take it?
Oh yeah, I can. I think that's absolutely an example of the school to prison pipeline and just pushing kids out of school and into the justice system. I think that's a super duper direct example. So yeah.
You're muted again.
Lord help me. I was just saying, I don't see any other questions, but if you do, Anna, please let me know if I miss some.
Yeah, I don't think I see anything else. So if there isn't any other questions, I am gonna drop a link, Google form in the chat. So if everyone that attended could fill that out, it's just an evaluation form on how we can make our webinars better. But I just wanted to say big thank you to Allison and Joran for doing this for us and talking to us about this. Again, we're all super passionate about criminal justice, and you know, hearing about all different aspects is something that's really important to us all. So big thank you to you guys, and thank you to everyone who came. Does anybody have anything else?
Thank you guys. Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Well, if nobody has any other questions or comments or anything, then I guess that's it. All right. I hope everyone has a super great night. And yeah, we'll see you next week with our next webinar Wednesday, everyone. Bye, guys.